Are you a history major?
Yeah, sure.
What other classes are you doing?
Yeah, like one of course Dr. Brian Hampton. It was like
Is that the 70s one?
yeah. Long 70s.
Yeah, I'm not. I helped with one last year, which was. Oh, I'm one of the MPhil students. So I'm writing about my topic's about the British nuclear bomb and how it connects to the end of the empire.
Really? Is it relevant?
Is it relevant? I mean, nuclear weaponry. I should hope so. I mean, I want PhD funding, so I hope it's relevant.
Okay.
Why?
Jimmy，唔係我嘅，我你又上呢個 course 啊？
係啊。
OK
Get to
OK。
graduate in about
咁有咩可以上啊？
但係你好似咩都冇帶咁。
嚇，帶嚟做咩啊？有咩要帶
？OK。好輕，我好輕鬆啊！
帶咩啊？
日日睇你都好輕鬆。
我攞我哋手機裝到水煙咪得。
我唔做 PM， 我不嬲都唔 job 嘅，都冇咩好 job， 除非要考試，考試人同講法。
考喎，
考
有 final 咩？
有咩我唔知啊。
冇啊，
都冇 course line。
唔係
有啊。
佢之前
有啊有啊。
幾時嘅事啊？
唔係 Central 好似有。
係啊
，Central 有啊 ，Central 有。
Central 有㗎。
審考試唔使嘅。
好似唔使㗎。
有我睇下先。
哇！考試我都唔會讀啦。
嚇！
我覺得考試會。
嚇唔係咯，數。
我覺得考試。
我中意寫 paper 多啲。
係我寧願寫 paper，即係我寫出 paper 咧都唔低 grade，雖然高，低先大佬。
咩叫 Central 有
Central Asia 呢個 course 有，呢個咪 Central Asia？
係咯。
嚇係咩？
有喎。
咁啊，
有
我應該係喺我喺係個網站 department 網站嗰度睇嘅。
嚇！
我喺咩？
佢唔係有咩？佢啱去做
啊，係咩？
係咩？
啱咗上 Moodle 咩？
幾時啊？
個手 line 嘛，佢擺上去。
啊係啊，我記得啊，係啊。
哦，幾時擺㗎佢？
嚇屌！咁都係呢幾日。
前幾日擺，
呢幾日㗎。有啊屌有 quiz。
有兩個 Chris，唔係同之前嗰個一樣，唔好係其他人教就得㗎啦。
哦，我問過啦，係佢教啊。
唔係，我想話咩叫 quiz base 同埋 paper base？
即係
即係可以揀我做。
我諗唔係啦啩。
係啊。係。
咁啊，梗係有揀做 paper 啦。
但係 paper 要打4000字。
4000字好似
4000字都係嘢。你劉志鵬嗰科你幾個 assignment 喎？幾個 assignment， 一個 assignment 2000字，第二個 assignment 3000字，第四個 assignment。
點解要咁多 history？ 點解要做 history？ 釘，仆街啦呢科。但我想講去 paper base 都要 quiz， 不過10% 少啲。
你要一個 quiz 定要兩個 quiz 啊？
梗係一個啦，
我一個啊 ，paper 啫，小事。
温書你又唔知道想寫幾長。
paper 啫，小事啦。
你讀幾多科 history？
我今個成，今個成讀得呢一科 history， 唔係兩科，我有兩科。
你有4科。
然之後有一科 business， 再加多其餘3科係 poly。
你 minor 定
minor。
So on the first day and you're already
Yeah.
Excited.
We'll see what you're like in December.
We're imagining we are taking actions.
Simon K's left. I'm sad. Yeah.
My name is Nicole Ganciolo. I will be the instructor for this course. So let's start know each other. Even if I see many faces that are well known. So Chan Chi-yin. Chan Ho Ching. Can you remind me the name? Annie. Chan Hui Lam. Chan Manjun. Chen Kai Yuan. Twist. Sorry. Twist. Okay. Chong Min Kwong. Chu Bat Ken. Chun Courtney Chun. Chung Hyu Ching. Fan Shunyan. Alexander Hong. Huang Zixin. Can you remind me your... Sorry for...
而家所有堂都係晏晝嘅真係。
Lai Yun. Lao Chunin. Isaac. Li Qingyun.
King.
Liu Jingquan.
J.
Sorry? J. Alberto Ma.
Hey. You're the only one who can pronounce my name properly.
On the other hand, I pronounce wrongly all the other names. Ng Bin Yi. Toby. Zachary River.
Yep. Here.
Seo Sumin. Troy Siderius. Song Jae-yong. Mohammed Tian. Alex Wong. Wong Puyuk. Okay, so I hope, I think the classroom is big enough.
You have left my name.
Well, maybe you didn't.
Yeah, I took this class actually.
Did you register? Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure.
I don't know. I printed out the class today, so I will check. Okay, so we have a certain amount of exchange students, if I understand correctly. 2 are from Korea, is that right? South Korea? Only 1? 2, right. Where are you from? South Korea? Which university? Both. If you are from another university? Oh, okay. Is it funny?
Yeah, no.
Exactly. What about the others? Are you from the US, right? 2 of you?
Canada.
3 of you? Canada. Canada and the US. Whereabouts in Canada and the US? Which university?
From New York City. We're both from Toronto. We both go to the University of Guelph. So it's about an hour outside the city.
Okay. Yeah. And what about New York City? You're studying in New York City?
No, I study at upstate New York.
Okay. What's the name of the university?
Hobart.
All right. Okay. So this is a course this is an introductory course about the history of Central Asia. Central Asia is sometimes called the Inner Asia. The difference is that Inner Asia is the name that people studying Chinese studies give to the Central Eurasian region. I say Eurasian because, of course, Europe and Asia are actually one continent, so we only conventionally separate them. So when you look at Asia, you have to have in mind not only former Soviet Central Asia, but especially Mongolia, Xinjiang, this area, so that has been under Chinese power for a few centuries. Central Asia, on the other hand, is the name used mostly by scholars coming from Russian Soviet studies. So when we say Central Asia, we refer mostly to the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, which I will introduce briefly in a moment. Sometimes Central Asia only refers to the southern Soviet republics, leaving aside Kazakhstan, which is the biggest state between South and Central Asia and Russia. Anyway, we will in this course we will use these two terms interchangeably, and we will focus on both former Soviet Central Asia and so-called Chinese Central Asia, mainly Xinjiang, and also partially Mongolia, right? Because Mongolia was very important, especially at the beginning of the period we are focusing on, but also later on. We will touch also Mongolian history. Okay, so let me introduce the organization of the course, the assignments, and then if you have any question, I can answer. I remind you that you can still save yourself the pain of attending this course by of course by the end of this week. If you don't do that by the end of this week, then you are stuck with this course until the end of the term. We don't have internet, which is wonderful, of course. Okay, so I cannot show you the
係咪個衰幣又冧咗？
I don't think it's a browser, just in case. Oh, all right. Oh, okay, right. I was surprised. Okay, sorry. This is the first time this happens in 9 years that I'm here. I don't know why. Anyway, I put on Moodle. You have on the Moodle page of this course the course outline with all the topics that we will touch during the course. The readings. I also uploaded all of the readings, so you will not have to go to the library looking for the readings. You have the PDFs of all the readings. I will keep the PDFs of the readings until the end of next week. So please download all the readings as soon as possible, and then I will delete the readings from the Moodle page. Okay. So the course is organized in the following way. I will lecture every week on Thursday, and then on Tuesday of the following week we will discuss the readings, primary and secondary sources, referring to the topic I lectured about on Thursday. All right. So you will have more days to read readings, to think about them, and to discuss them. So this is very much a course that is focused on the discussion of the readings. So I want you to read the readings, and then we will discuss them so I can help you better understand them. And I think this is the best way to assimilate information and to learn. Therefore, this is a course that requires attendance, or at least attendance on Tuesday, right? So everybody knows what's happening in Hong Kong right now. I know that there is a class boycott going on, and my political ideas about what's happening are not important here, but I don't want to penalize people who want to take part in this protest. Nonetheless, if you could come at least on Tuesday, I guess that I should say that to people who is not not in the classroom that started to boycott the class today. But anyway, perhaps I will send a message to everybody. Anyway, so the assessment of the course is based for 45% on the discussion of the readings. So I uploaded a rubric that the people who attended other courses with me already know the rubric very well, about how I will assess the class participation in the discussion, and this will count as 45% of the final grade. Then there is a 5% of the final grade which depends on the class participation, which means usually it means attendance. Given the extraordinary situation, the term attendance is not. I will not be strict in taking attendance, but if you arrive late or you disrupt the classes by screaming or something like that, of course will impact your grade by only by 5%. I'm tolerant with screaming. The other 50% of the assessment of the grade is based on written assignments, and here I give you two alternatives. All right, so you can choose to take the two quizzes. One will be held on October 10th, and the other at the end of the course on December 2nd. So there will be open questions. So you will have questions about the readings that we've done, and you will have a certain amount of time to 1 hour and a half for the first quiz and a bit more for the second. So if you choose to take the quiz, the first quiz will count for 20%, if I'm not mistaken, let's check, and the second for 30% of the final grade. So these quizzes are not required a bit of a kind of reasoning, so it's not just ticking boxes. But I also want to give the opportunity to people who would like to write a final paper to do so. So if you choose to do a final paper, which will be 3,500 to 4,000 words long, you can do so, and so you will skip the second quiz. So in that case, if you decide to do a final paper, the final paper will count for 35% of the final grade, and the first quiz 15%, right? Okay. I'm sorry that I cannot show you. I hope you're following me. Okay. If you have questions, please ask. Okay. So this is more or less what I wanted to say. You have a lot of information in the course outline. You have basically the questions that will be asked every class discussion in relation to primary and secondary sources. If you are scared to death by the length of the readings, be aware that what I want you to do during the discussions is simply to be able to participate in the discussion. So if you read the minimum amount of readings that you are requested to do by every week is one primary source and one secondary source, because you have to be able to participate in the discussion. And usually every week, each week, you will have more or less 2 secondary sources, 2 articles or book chapters, and from 1 to 3 primary sources, depending on their length. So if you manage to read everything, will be great. If you don't, please come to class having read at least one primary source and 1 secondary source. Okay. By the way, I think I forgot to ask. The exchange students, are you studying history as your primary subject, or yes?
Yeah, it's my minor.
Yeah, history minor.
No,
My major.
Major. Minor. What about you? Major. Okay. So everybody knows the difference between primary and secondary sources, right? I don't have to. Okay. Yeah. So for this week, today I will just introduce the region and the main kind of division to orient yourself in the kind of Central Asian landscape. On Thursday, so the first week is an exception to the rule of the lecture plus discussion. I will just lecture both today and Thursday. Then we will have 1 week with, we will skip class October the 1st, which is the national holiday in China, and also on Thursday, October 3rd. During the week in the middle of October, so October 15th and 17th, I will also lecture both days. So basically, we will have 10 discussions, 10 in-class discussions, and I will grade your participation in the discussion every time. It is just a way to encourage you to read, but don't worry. I will not ask you questions in an aggressive way. I just want to be sure that you've read at least part of the readings, and so I will. The grading every time is a way to ensure that. But I will drop your worst grade for the discussion. So only 9 grades will count, and each grade will count for 5% of the final grade. So altogether, 45% of the final grade. Yeah, I think I told you more or less everything. Yeah. So the final quiz is will be held on December 2nd, and the final paper is due on December 9th. And you will upload it on Turnitin. Okay. Do you have any question? Something is not clear? You want me to clarify something? No? Okay. All right. So what's your? Let me ask you. What's your degree of familiarity with the region? Did anybody go to the region as a tourist, perhaps, or no? Nobody.
There are some Kazakhs visiting us this summer.
What?
There are some Kazakhs visiting us.
In the world, sure.
Yeah.
Here, I mean?
Yeah, in Lingnan.
Yeah.
This summer. Yeah, we have an exchange program.
Yeah, exactly. I think there are also cousins here as we speak. So, yeah. Have you met some of them?
Yeah, because we have the summer academy. It's held by OSL, and they invite the Kazakh come here and let some students to pay a visit to Kazakh, to the farm there. So.
I see. Okay, so if nobody is familiar at all with the region, this general introduction will be useful for everybody. So one of the main kind of ideas linked to this region is this concept of Silk Roads. So there has been an exhibition recently in Hong Kong of this painting, which is a Ming era painting of the so-called Silk Road. This is a reproduction, which is of course smaller than the original. And so the Ming, you remember, right, from the 14th century to the 17th century, and so this is a painting that depicts the lands from Western China to Mecca. This is the Red Sea, probably, with the waves. It's a beautiful painting, so you can have a look during the break. And so one of the this idea of the Silk Road has been invented, actually, this term at the end of the 19th century by a German geographer in 1877. So it's a relatively recent idea, and this concept focuses on not on Central Asia, actually. So this is the idea of Central Asia as a connecting region between Europe and China, between regions that are supposedly more important, and as we will see especially in the next class, we should think about the Silk Road in a slightly different way. It's also interesting to read how the Silk Road is conceptualized in publications such as this book, which goes with the map, which is of course very Sinocentric, like as if the Chinese or the Chinese merchants or the Chinese kind of rulers organized kind of this trade crossing the Eurasian continent, and of course in Europe you have instead Eurocentric views of the same trade. But actually, only very few merchants, if any, made the whole trip from Europe to China or the other way around. So actually, it's more useful to think about these connections as a network, as a grid, in which Central Asian merchants and also nomads played an important role. But as I said, we will see that mostly in the next lecture, which will be devoted to the expansion of Islam in Central Asia. Okay, so. So this is a typical Central Asian landscape with a station where you could post, where you could stop during the trip in Central Asian mountains, crossing the mountains, and change horses or rest. So this is the region I already mentioned in terms of, this is the maximum extension, but actually nobody calls the entire green region Central Asia, of course, right? Pakistan is clearly part of South Asia, and Afghanistan is at the border between Central Asia and South Asia. So it is as much part of the northern region and the south. Iran, so Persia. Iran was called Iran only since the 1930s of the 20th century. Until the beginning of the 20th century, it was called Persia. Is not part of Central Asia, usually is considered part of the Middle East, but Persian culture is crucial to understand the Central Asian history, Persian culture and language. Tibet also is not considered part of Central Asia, but nonetheless, the connections with especially Mongolia and what is now southern Russia, which is inhabited also by Mongol peoples, is extremely important. The spread of Buddhism and so on. So we will be focusing instead on this region and Xinjiang and also partially Mongolia. So this is what I just told you basically, and so we will focus on the red part plus Mongolian plus Tajikistan. So these are the languages spoken in the region. The majority of the population by far in Central Asia speak Turkic languages. So in English there is a difference between Turkish and Turkic. Okay, Turkish is the language spoken in Turkey. Turkic is the family of languages to which most of Central Asian languages belong. So Kazakh, Karakalpak here, Turkmen, Uzbek, and Uyghur, and Kyrgyz, of course, and also Azeri here. But Azerbaijan is part of the Caucasus, but still, the Azeri language is the most similar to Turkish. So basically, Turkish spoken in Turkey and Azeri Turkic are basically understandable to each other, whereas the languages east from the Caspian are not immediately understandable for a Turkish-speaking person. And then there is Mongolian, of course, which is also considered part of the same family of languages, the Altaic family, but it's not a Turkic language and is completely not understandable, of course, to Turkic-speaking people. And then the other major family of languages is the Persian language. And the Tajiks here speak a form of Persian. And there are also Persian-speaking communities in what is now Uzbekistan. This is something that you will see. You will see how this has an important historical aspect. So this is the Turkic-speaking area. You see that most of the Turkic-speaking people, well, in terms of numbers, probably now the numbers of the Turkic-speaking population here is more or less the same as the numbers of the Turkish-speaking population in Turkey, because Turkey is extremely populated. But the biggest number of Turkic languages is spoken exactly in Central Asia, and then there are also Turkic-speaking people in the Russian far north and in the Volga region, right? The Tatars of the Volga, the Bashkirs, which are not part of Central Asia, but of course are historically linked to Central Asia. And of course, these are the Uyghurs. You see that in this map, Uyghur and Uzbek are colored in the same way because Uyghur language is the closest to the Uzbek language. So they are mutually understandable to some extent, and they are much closer than Uyghur and Kazakh or Uyghur and Kyrgyz. Okay. There were historically a lot of connections between the Tarim Basin here, what is now Xinjiang, and the regions that has become Uzbekistan in the 20th century. And the other major linguistic family, as I said, is the Persian-speaking area. So mostly Persian, then Dari in Afghanistan, and in Tajikistan, which was part of the Soviet Union and is part of Central Asia. So Persian was for centuries the language of high culture in vast regions of the Islamic world. So it's an extremely important language, especially for South Asia, in India, and what are now in Pakistan, but also partially for Central Asia. So this area really culturally is an area in which the Persian culture, Turkic culture, and then much more recently Russian and Chinese cultures came into contact and produced a specific cultural blend history. This is the physical map of the region, and Central Asia is divided between very high mountains, not as high, of course, as the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau, but still very high mountains here. So there are states at the present moment, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the territory of which is mostly mountains. And instead, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. Even Kazakhstan is so big that it has also areas that are mountainous. These are the Altai Mountains, and also the Tian Shan here that reach 6,000 meters. So they're extremely high. But most of the territory, instead of Kazakhstan, is made of steppe, so grasslands, and also deserts, small deserts in the south. And Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are more arid of Kazakhstan because they are more to the south, and also, especially Turkmenistan is quite a plain area, and so this is basically the division. So the different states they control very different territories. So this is the political map of the region. As we will see during the course, Central Asia is fascinating for many different reasons. One of the reasons is that you can look at processes of nation building, of creation of nations, in a fairly recent period. So the borders of the region were basically drawn in the first half of the 20th century, so less than 100 years ago. And this is the so-called national delimitation of 1924. We will have a week about the 1920s, and so I will explain in detail how this happened. But I want you to give this date early on because it's a very important date in the history of Central Asia. So before 1924, there were no ethnically denominated territories, right? So in 1924, it was the division of the territory into Soviet republics, which were no independent by any means, and they were not even autonomous. They were under the control of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and of Moscow. But still, it's important that in the early Soviet Union kind of acted as an incubator of nations. And so there is a debate in the historiography about how old these nations were, whether the Soviet Union really created new nations or instead there was a process of crystallization, a process of consolidation of already existing ethnic communities. But nonetheless, so Central Asia is it's also fascinating because you can look at processes that are very important in modern history in the very same region. So Central Asia was colonized both by the Russians and by the Chinese. And so it's a colonial area, colonialism, and therefore post-colonialism after 1991 for former Soviet Union are important categories to understand Central Asia. Central Asia was obviously part of the communist world, and Xinjiang is still still dominated by the Communist Party. As I said, Central Asia, it's an interesting, a very interesting case study for the study of the creation of nations. And this process of a national consolidation was not limited to Central Asia, of course. This was an overall Soviet policy that was applied in Central Asia in Central Asia too. So we will see that in comments. So this gives you the idea about where Central Asia was within the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea about the states we're talking about, the regions. Uzbekistan is the most populous state in the region with more than 30 million people. Xinjiang is also quite big for Central Asian standards, and Kazakhstan is also almost the population of Kazakhstan is almost 20 million. The other four states that we will mention are instead quite much smaller, and so in total we are talking about a population that now is more or less 100, slightly less than 100 million people, and the former Soviet Central Asia is basically a bit more than 2/3 of the entire population. So, of course, if compared to China, it is a small region, kind of geographically, but nonetheless, it's a significant population. Okay, so how to make sense of the region? These are the kind of you have to orient yourself, right, in the readings and in thinking about the region. So keep in mind these very broad distinctions that you can use. You can ask yourself whether a specific region falls in one of the other of the categories. So I already mentioned the Persian-Turkic kind of divide, right? So with Tajikistan being the area, the Tajiks, okay? Tajiks, or the Tajik language being a Persian language, and the other Turkic languages, and therefore also historical and cultural connections with other Persian language areas or Turkic language areas. Another important distinction is the one that I already mentioned. So the areas where the steppe and deserts are the most important physical feature of the area. Areas in which mountains predominates, and areas in which irrigated agriculture is the main economic activity. So the distinction between steppe and deserts and areas of irrigated agriculture, of course, is largely corresponding to the distinction between peoples that were formerly nomadic and peoples that instead practiced agriculture. So in a moment we will see this distinction more in detail. In thinking about the current issues about Central Asia, it's also very important to bear in mind the distinction between states that are upstream in the river systems of the region, and they build dams to create electricity up in the mountains on their territory, and then they send electricity to the downstream states, and states that are rich or poor in oil and gas. So let me give you a general orientation here. So Kazakhstan is the Kazakhs were formerly nomadic, okay, until the 20th century. So the transition from nomadism to other sectors of the economy that during the Soviet Union led to huge tragedies when 1/3 of the Kazakhs died in the 1930s during the biggest famine, one of the biggest famines of the 20th century. So the transition from nomadism to something else is also a very important historical question in a historical topic in the history of Central Asia. So the Kazakhs, former nomads, stepped. The Kazakhstan is rich in oil and gas, and therefore now is the richest country in the region. Okay, the Kyrgyz. Remember that Kyrgyzstan is mostly made of mountains. The Kyrgyz were also nomads, Their nomadism was mountain nomadism. So they moved with their herds up in the mountains, and the Kyrgyzstan is very poor of oil. They don't have any oil or gas deposits, and so it's a much poorer country, but it's an upstream country that takes advantage of its position up in the mountain to produce electricity through by building dams. Tajikistan, the Tajiks were former mostly peasants. We will see that the creation of Tajikistan is very peculiar because it's very much linked to the creation of Uzbekistan. But in any case, very poor country, also mountainous country, no oil and gas upstream, and Tajikistan went through a civil war in the 1990s, and so it is the state that had the most problematic kind of transition between the Soviet period and the post-Soviet period. Uzbekistan, as I showed you, the most demographically significant, the biggest population in the region. Uzbekistan, the Uzbeks, partially pastoral, but most of the population are made of former peasants. So Uzbekistan has the biggest amount of agricultural land that historically has been exploited in Central Asia. So, and also Uzbekistan has some deposit of oil and gas, but much less than Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan. So Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan are the richest in terms of oil and gas. Turkmenistan is also the most dictatorial regime in Central Asia today. There is a very extremely close dictatorship, and so therefore the economic performance of Turkmenistan, and the two things are linked, is dismal, and they are having hyperinflation, and they are going through extremely hard times at the moment. But nonetheless, potentially Turkmenistan is as rich as Kazakhstan in terms of the deposit of oil and gas. Okay, and so of course these hydrocarbon reserves resources are mostly, until 1991, they were they were used by the Soviet economic system, but after 1991, they are, the direction of their marketization reverted to the east. So now China has become the most important client, and so pipelines have been built from Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, which, as I said, are the most important producers, across Uzbekistan and reaching China. So during the last week of the course, we will talk about the increasing economic integration between Central Asia and China, and what the consequence could be for the region. So this is part, of course, of what has been dubbed, labeled the Belt and Road Initiative, right? The increasing of the economic interconnection of China with countries, mostly in Eurasia. And so for Central Asia, the connection is a connection made by trade, but especially by pipelines and the selling of hydrocarbon resources to China. The other main connection is between China and Central Asia is given by water use. So part of the rivers that flow in Central Asia come from China, especially the Ili and the Irtysh. Irtysh is a huge river that then ends into the Arctic Ocean in Siberia, and so there are complex problems of water use division between China and the Central Asian countries. So this is also an important aspect. The biggest rivers in the region are the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya. These names will come back over and over again during the course, so I invite you to remember them. So the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya are, to some extent, the rivers that basically shape the region, both in terms of geographically, but also economically, because they create a possibility for agriculture in the most populated areas of the region. Okay, so this is the a computer modified photograph of the Eurasian continent with Central Asia and with the steppe belt, the center of Eurasia highlighted, and so you see the importance of this belt in connecting the two extremes of the Eurasian continent and two of the three mostly populated areas in the world. So the European subcontinent, the South Asian subcontinent, and China. All right. So this is the step from which our story begins, right? Because we will talk about the expansion of steppe empires, and you can see how dry seems the area south of the steppe here, especially in the Aral region. So that you see an X there in the pink belt, and the X is where I was here when I took this photograph. So this gives you, this is a place in Kazakhstan, northwest of Aktube, northwest of the former Aral Sea. And this gives you an idea about how the steppe looks like. So huge amount of grass. For those who come from North America, then this landscape is more familiar. So the other area in which there are huge grasslands, of course, is North America and partially South America. But nonetheless, this steppe belt is unparalleled in the world in terms of extension and in terms of connecting, as I said, areas of ancient civilizations and hugely populated areas. Okay, so so this is our story begins more or less 1,000 years ago. We will see briefly during the next lecture the expansion of Islam, and then the creation of the Mongol Empire and its successor empires starting in the 13th century. But I want you to remember that around 1,000 years ago, the population of the world was less than 5% of the population today, like 300 million people. And these are how much the different areas of Eurasia of Asia actually, were populated. And but an important point is that the 70% of the population of the world today still live in the same 4.25 million square miles of the world, out of a total of a landmass of 57.5 million square miles. So Central Asia has been in between these areas of concentrated populations, the two areas out of the three, right, China and Europe, of the biggest concentration of population across the period we're talking about, and actually across history. So to give you an idea, the Mongols will manage to conquer at the maximum extension of their empire about 10 million square miles. So almost less than 20%, but not so much less than 20% of the entire landmass of the world. So, and so this is the fact that the relation, now the relative importance demographically of different continents is changing. So Africa and South Asia will become more important in the future, but nonetheless, there is a kind of striking continuity in the demographic concentration of the human population over the century and actually the millennium. Okay, so our story begins with the nomad empires, and this is also a story of the relation between humans and animals. So nomads would ride small but very resilient horses. You see how small they are, and these are not not very much unlike the horses on which Genghis Khan and the Mongols conquered most of Eurasia. And this is a photo. This is a contemporary photo, I think, of Kazakhs in Mongolia. I'm sure they are Kazakhs. You can recognize them because of this typical decorative motif, which is a Kazakh one. But in any case, this is a contemporary photo, and these are Kazakhs from the early 20th century. So you see the kind of, and this is a typical, of course, nomadic yurt, right? That is, with some variation, it's extremely similar to the different nomadic population. So you see that horses were also used for milk. Some of the most characteristic beverage in Kazakhstan is fermented mare's milk, and also camel milk is drunk in Kazakhstan, which is called fermented camel's milk. It's called shubat. It's very tasty, and instead of fermented mare's milk, it's called kumis. So also milk products were taken from the horses. So, what is nomadism? Nomadism is one of the most important categories that we will use over and over again during the course. So, if you look at the encyclopedia definition, nomadism is a way of life of peoples who do not live continually in the same place but move cyclically or periodically. So, nomadism in English and similar words in other European languages refer to the movement. So also people doing professions in a modern economy at the margin of society, like the gypsy communities in Europe, for instance, are usually called nomads. But the nomads we're focusing on for Central Asian history are pastoral nomads, right? So some author prefer to call them pastoral nomads, some other prefer to put the accent on pastoralism, and so they call them nomadic pastoralists, okay? But these two expressions mean the same thing. So usually one way of distinguishing the difference between a nomadic community and instead a community of pastoralists, of herdsmen, which is not nomadic, is that in the nomadic community the entire household moves in the nomadic path, nomadic movements during the year. So when an entire community, and in any case, if you defined, if you ask ask yourself whether a household is nomadic or not, if the entire household made by a large family moves from one pasture to another during the year, this is a nomadic community. You also don't have to think that the nomads were moving randomly, looking for resources. In almost all nomadic communities, especially nomadic pastoralists in Central Asia, there were a very precisely fixed path, nomadic movements every year from different pasture areas, typically in the south during the winter and further north during the summer, following the growing of the grass. And this was due by the fact that, of course, the regularity of the movement was due by the fact that there were many nomadic communities, so the different tribes had achieved a level of coordination, and so usually within the nomadic communities, land was considered property of the clan if there were permanent dwellings, especially in the winter quarters. But they were not personal property, whereas the herds were personal property, okay, of the head of the family. So in most cases, especially the Kazakhs were the biggest nomadic population in modern times in Central Asia, and so we refer to them quite often. So there was this important difference in the property regime, distinguishing between land and the herds. Okay, but again, remember that the nomadic movements were regular and were regulated by customary division of areas of pasture between the different clans. Of course, this was not written in stone, in the sense that when there were crises brought about by weather conditions or by political nature, by invasions and so on, the division between pastors of different clans could be disrupted, leading to conflicts. But it's important to remember that the norm was the regularity and the division of the different areas. So what is the another? I think that you already know this, but a point is important to remember is that most of the sources we have about nomadic peoples come from the sedentary populations and sedentary states, sedentary cultures and empires, because the writing was much less widespread in nomadic societies, and therefore it's usually quite difficult to figure out what happened, very simply, in nomadic societies. And so the study of nomadic societies in the past is multidisciplinary precisely for this reason. So archaeology is very much used to understand the past of nomadic societies, much more than for other societies. So this is a longish quote from Sima Qian, that, as you know, is the founder of historiography in China, and this refers to the population of the Xiongnu, which is a name given by the Chinese to a confederation of northern barbarians in the early centuries, in the centuries before the Common Era. And it's interesting to read these words, because they give you the pretty much some of the ideas that will recur and will return in the relations between sedentary empires and nomadic powers. So the account of the Xiongnu, Sima Qian writes, they live in the region of the northern barbarians, and they wander from place to place, pasturing their animals. So the idea that the movement were regulated, of course, was missed by observers, outsiders of their society. The animals they raise consist mainly of horses, cows, and sheep, but include such rare beasts as camels, asses, mules, and the wild horses. So the fact that the nomads of the steppe belt raised different animal species was true then, before the Common Era, as it remained true up until today. Okay, so these were different species that were used. They move about in search of water and pasture and have no walled cities or fixed dwellings, nor do they engage in any kind of agriculture. Their lands, however, are divided into regions under the control of various leaders. So there was the acknowledgement that the land was actually under political authority. They had no writing, and even promises and agreements are only verbal. And then comes a very important aspect of the perception of the so-called nomads, and we will see that this category is a bit too kind of black and white, so to speak. So the little boys start out by learning to ride sheep and shoot birds and rats with a bow and arrow. And when they get a little older, they shoot foxes and hares, which are used for food. And of course, they start to ride horses. Thus, all the young men are able to use a bow and act as armed cavalry in time of war. So the most important feature of this society, that is a warlike society, that the entire male population can become an army of cavalrymen. And this is the secret of the military strength of nomadic societies vis-a-vis sedentary societies. And so this also is true kind of, it was not always true, but as a general rule, until the invention of firearms, there was a potential superiority of nomadic society, military superiority of nomadic societies vis-a-vis sedentary society that shaped the history of Eurasia for millennia. Okay. It is their custom to herd their flocks in times of peace and make their living by hunting, but in periods of war they take up arms and go off plundering and marauding expeditions. This seems to be their inborn nature. Their only concern is self-advantage, and they know nothing of propriety or righteousness. Of course, this was typical stereotypes. But these ideas about the military prowess of the nomads was basically true, and there from the beginning. This is a photo of contemporary nomads in Mongolia. This is the top, the roof of the yurt, and the camel, of course, is used as a truck to move during the nomadic movement. And this is another photo. So these are Mongols, today's Mongols, and these are Kazakhs during the 1920s. A photograph of that. There is also a cart, but the camel, of course, is very important. And here there is everything. This is the head of the household. This, of course, is the wife and two children. And this guy is Karakalpak, which is also another population that was considered nomadic. Okay, a difference that you have to keep in mind is that there were different kinds of nomadism. So the difference is between horizontal and vertical nomadism. Horizontal nomadism is basically nomads and nomadic pastoralists moving in the plains, in the huge steppe distance and deserts. And so usually the winter quarters will be toward the south, and the northern quarters, the summer pastures would be in the north. So typically these transhumans is when, of course, right, the herdsmen move with their herds, were extremely long. It could be thousands of kilometers long. And so the horizontal nomadism was mainly practiced by Kazakhs and Mongols that lived in the wide steppes, even if there are Kazakhs who live in the mountains, but the majority of the Kazakhs live on the steppe. Vertical nomadism, as the name implies, is the transhumance from valleys to mountain pastures. So the Kyrgyz, who are considered as nomadic as the Kazakhs, they moved on a much shorter distances, but they moved from the valleys to the mountains. Okay, and of course you go to the altitude pastures during the summer when it's warmer. So actually, the difference between nomadism and transhumance is often blurred, but as a rule of thumb, the idea that the entire household moves qualifies nomadism. So these are Kyrgyz on a summer pasture in the mountains. You see, well, they also have very modern ski things, and also that's a gun. So this is a mountain village with now with permanent dwellings, and this is a picture drawn, published in a Soviet book of the 1920s about the Kazakhs, explaining how Kazakhs living near the Sirdarya, one of the two big rivers, moved. So this is how the situation of the Kazakhs looked like during the winter, with permanent dwellings here and yurts close to permanent dwellings. You see that they are walled, they are fenced, there are fences built by the Kazakhs. So this was a property of the household, and the yurt was close to the permanent dwellings, also with chimneys and so on. Okay, and then during the summer, the yurts would move, but in many cases would move very close actually. So, especially in the 1920s, as we will see, the Kazakhs suffered a lot during the period of the First World War, the Revolution, and the famine of the beginning of the 20s. There were two big famines, one at the beginning of the 20s, one at the beginning of the 30s. So when nomadic societies went through big subsistence crises like famine, they tended to lose a lot of animals, and so their pastoralist movements tended to be shorter. So in the 1920s was a period in which the nomadic movements of the Kazakhs were particularly short, but nonetheless, only a tiny minority of Kazakhs moved further away than 100 kilometers. Most of them remained within 20 kilometers from winter quarters. So you see how nomadic people, yes, but their movements were very limited. And well, this is a photo also from the 1920s of a Kazakh winter quarter. Okay, so this is a very poor, as you can see, house, but it's built with stone, and this was a winter quarter. So even in good times, you don't have to think that what Sima Qian wrote, that the nomads were only pastoralists, is true. It's not true. So there are no pure nomads. Any people usually described as pastoral nomads usually practices multi-resource economy, a mixture of pastoralism and other activities. So for instance, the Kazakhs, as I said, the biggest nomadic pastoral people in the first half of the 20th century, 1/4 of them practiced agriculture according to Soviet statistics of the beginning of the 20th century. So this distinction between nomadic pastoralists and agriculturists is more blurred. It remains true that the Kazakhs, in comparison with other populations like the Uzbek, were more nomadic pastoralists, but they were by no means all of them. Also, the so-called nomadic peoples practiced irrigated agriculture in the river valleys. So the Kazakhs again practiced irrigated agriculture in the river. So this is, for instance, a photo of Kazakhs tilling the land in southern Kazakhstan in the 1920s, and you see that they were using camels as traction animals. Huge, big camels. And also, you see, this is another photo of Kazakhs in the 1920s with women preparing grain for as food. So you have to keep in mind that all the so-called nomadic peoples, their diet was not made only or even mostly, in many cases, by products like meat and dairy products, but they were also consuming a lot of millet, grain, and so this gives you the idea how much there was an interdependence between nomadic pastoralist societies and sedentary societies. Okay? I'm giving you just a general kind of information that you have to keep in mind during the course, because otherwise you may kind of fall back into the stereotypes that most of people have about these populations, especially nomadic populations. So the diet was based a lot on plants, grains, and grains were partially cultivated by the very populations. Usually there was a nomadic camp of pastoralists, and not all of them would move from the winter quarters to the other quarters, to the other pastures during other seasons. Part of the community would remain all year long in the winter quarters and will till the land. So, but nonetheless, usually these nomadic societies are not self-sufficient for their consumption of grains, and so they depend a lot from the trade with sedentary communities. You see, this is a picture of a Kazakh small village close to the Aral Sea in the middle of the 19th century, and the Kazakhs also practiced fishing in the rivers and in the sea. So this was another economic activity within the multi-resource activities of the nomadic communities. Okay, so speaking of the Aral Sea and the Caspian Sea, there are basically four main lakes in the region. The Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea, they are called seas because their water is salty. The Aral Sea was salty, the Aral Sea almost disappeared, even if not entirely. Lake Balkhash and the Issyk-Kul Lake in Kyrgyzstan, which is the biggest alpine lake in the world, which is quite a high altitude, but is huge. So the Aral Sea is at the center of probably the biggest environmental catastrophe of the 20th century. The Aral Sea disappeared because the water of the two rivers that used to feed the Aral Sea, the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya. This is not the Amur, this is a mistake that I didn't notice. Amu River. So Darya means river in Turkic languages. So Sir Darya and Amu Darya simply means Amu River and Sir River, but internationally it has been it's conventional to call them Sir Darya and Amu Darya. So we will call them this way. Anyway, so the water that used to feed the Aral Sea was used for extending irrigated agriculture in the river valleys. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan during the Soviet times, especially after the Second World War, as we will see in the second last week of this course. And this led to the drying up of the Aral Sea almost totally. The Aral Sea, of course, had an evaporation of a partial evaporation of its water, as every lake, all the lakes worked this way, and therefore had an influence on the climate of the region. So the drying up of the Aral Sea led to a drying up of the climate of the region. Not to speak of the other aspects, such as the fact that there was the use of a huge amount of chemicals for agriculture during the Soviet Union. The chemicals would end up into the Aral Sea, brought by the rivers. So the drying up of the Aral Sea left a desert full of polluted with chemicals. And then the winds blowing out the sands of the former bottom of the sea spread these chemicals in huge areas, and so led to terrible health conditions for populations, especially living here close to the Aral Sea. Anyway, we will talk about how much this environmental catastrophe was led by the Soviet state, and how instead it can be compared to ongoing environmental catastrophe like the destruction of the equatorial forests, not only South America but also in Southeast Asia or Africa. So how much? Because this environmental catastrophe is often described as kind of outcome of the Soviet communist system, but actually there are many. I think it's a case which is very interesting in comparative terms, and of course it's interesting in its own terms as because of the very tragic event. Okay, so another thing I wanted to tell you immediately is that this term will recur many times during the course, so better to know it immediately. Transoxiana. Transoxiana means the land across the Oxus. Oxus was the name that the Greeks and then the Romans and so on in Europe were calling the Amu Darya. Okay? So Transoxiana means the land across the river, the land that lies beyond the river, so basically north of the Amu Darya, meaning this area. Okay? Aral Sea, Amu Darya, Oxus, Jaxartes, Sir Darya. So this area is Transoxiana. Okay? And you can also find in our readings the name Mavaranath, which is the Arab name of Transoxiana, which means exactly the same thing, the land that lies beyond the river. And this was the center of one of the biggest empires in the history of the region, the empire created by Timur Tamerlane, and we will see that story next week. So the two rivers, as I said, basically create the topography of the region, and also make possible the expansion of agriculture. And so you see here the green areas. These are the areas of irrigated agriculture in the region. So here are the two big river valleys. This is the river of the. This is the valley of the Narin River that ends up then in the basin, and this is the Fergana Valley. The Fergana Valley is also another area that it's very important, and we'll come back during the course. So this is the Fergana Valley between Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. These are very strange borders that were created by the Soviet Union in the 1920s, as I said. Somebody says that they were created with the purpose of dividing up populations and making the region unmanageable, if not by a central power like Moscow, so a kind of divide and rule theory. But actually, as we will see, this was not actually how things went. So this is the more kind of political map of the region. So why Fergana is important? Remember that this tiny area basically comprises 20% of the output, agricultural output of the entire region. So it's by far the most fertile area. and also more or less this amount of population. So it's by far the most important economically and demographically area. And so it's important to have in mind where it is located and why it is important. Okay, so these are photos of the irrigated agriculture areas. So irrigation is another very important aspect that we come back to it during the course. Okay, so thank you, and see you on Thursday. And as I said, if you have questions, feel free to drop me a line or to come back during my office hours.
Can we pick the recent news as the source for the paper?
Sorry?
Like the recent news, like the tension between Russia and China over their saturation or something.
Well, suggest me a specific topic, and then we'll see if the topic is feasible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
陰間係啊，佢話係啊，唉，都係我哋㗎啦，就邊個啊 ？Hello，落去上堂啊！